BSides DC 2017 videos are brought to you by Threat Quotient, introducing the industry's first threat intelligence platform designed to enable threat operations and management, and Data Tribe, a new kind of startup studio co-building the next generation of commercial cybersecurity, analytics, and big data product companies.
My name is Gabriel Ryan. I'm a penetration tester at Gotham Digital Science. We're like Aon's security consulting arm, I guess you could call it that. Anyone here from like Northern Virginia? Yeah, no, I'm like really happy to be here because like my first security job was actually in Northern Virginia, so I'm pretty thrilled. I don't miss the traffic though, you know, but yeah. So a couple new things in this presentation. We're going to be talking about two new types of wireless technique. We're going to talk about hostile portal attacks, which is a way of grabbing Active Directory credentials without having direct network access. And we're also going to talk about indirect wireless pivots, which is a way of using rogue AP attacks to bypass port-based access control mechanisms on wireless networks. So before we go into any of this, we have to take like an obligatory look at WPA2 EAP. And no discussion about WPA2 EAP is really complete without talking about rogue AP attacks, which is the means that you typically use to steal credentials for these kinds of networks. So rogue AP attacks they're pretty much the bread and butter of modern wireless networks. You can use them for stealthy man-in-the-middle attacks, stealing radius creds, as we said, all kinds of really cool stuff. And the simplest example of how to do a rogue AP attack, or the simplest rogue AP attack out there, is something called the evil twin attack. To use an analogy actually first given to me by that guy right there, who got me into wireless. Big round of applause for that guy. Okay. Sorry, Scott. So a good analogy of like how evil twin attacks work is, let's say that you have an open network, and we're going to call this DEF CON open because it's probably the most secure network in existence and everything. Yeah. So you have these four devices, and they're associated with this network. If you were to spin up your own wireless hotspot, right, and you were to give this hotspot the same network name, ESSID, and channel as the one that you're attacking, how would these devices be able to tell the difference between these two access points? Well, the truth is that they wouldn't be able to. And as long as you're able to provide a better signal-to-noise ratio, that is, your signal strength is better than the other one, these devices will actually drop their connections and associate with you. So that's the fundamental, rogue access point attack that pretty much everything else is based off of or expands off of. So these attacks, they're not anything. They've been around for like a really, really long time. The first one, they started to emerge around 2002. The first documentation that I could find was the Wireless LAN Security Fact by C.W. Klaus that starts talking about evil twin attacks. About a year later, you have AS Sleep released by Josh Wright, which is a tool that expands off of that. 2004, you actually see the implementation of a karma attack by Dino Diazovi and Shane McCauley. 4 years after that, you have Free Radius WPE, which is actually Josh Wright and Brad Antonowitz figured out how to use these attacks to steal credentials from radius networks. Welcome, grab a seat. And by 2014, karma attacks had actually stopped being nearly as effective as they used to be. So two researchers from South Africa, Dom White and Ian de Villiers, came up with the improved karma attacks. Released a tool called Mana that actually made these attacks very, very, very effective once again. And very recently, the guy who wrote Wi-Fi Fisher came up with the Lure 10 attack, which exploits Windows Wi-Fi sense to a whole new way of doing this. So as you can see, this is actually there's a pretty rich history of using these kinds of attacks. Rogue AP attacks, however, they primarily are used to fill like one of two functions. And the roles that they fall into are either man-in-the-middle attacks, which you can use to steal credentials for things, or they're used to breach WPA or WPA2 networks, the ones that use EAP. So in this talk, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to talk about rogue AP attacks as a means of lateral movement. So before we continue, we also should talk about how would you use a rogue access point attack to breach a WPA2 EAP network. So anyone here actually know how EAP works? Okay, awesome, great. So logically, we're going to start out with kind of a logical high-level look at how EAP works, right? We're going to be looking at EAP PEEP and EAP TTLS specifically. So logically, the way that EAP works, it's a transaction that occurs between the client and the authentication server. So the first thing that happens is the client, that's like your wireless device, your laptop or whatever, is going to send an authentication request to the authentication server. The authentication server is going to respond with an X509 certificate that's going to send to the client. Now the reason why it's doing this is it needs to establish to the client that it can be trusted. Otherwise the client doesn't know who it's actually attempting to authenticate with. So in this So at this point, the client then either accepts or rejects the certificate. If it accepts the certificate, it means it trusts the authentication server, and a secure tunnel is established between the client and the authentication server. So once that secure tunnel is established, we move on from the outer authentication, which is where we were at before, and then we now begin what's called the inner authentication process, this is actually where credentials are entered, and you enter in your username and password, and that stuff gets sent to the authentication server. We'll look more at how that works in a second. But that inner authentication is going to occur through this secure tunnel. And the reason why you need that secure tunnel is that remember that EAP is the authentication mechanism that we're using to provide access to the WPA capabilities of the network. So until this entire process is finished, this WPA network is not actually operating as a WPA network. You don't get that WPA until after this process succeeds. So this entire transaction is happening over open Wi-Fi. So without the secure tunnel, an attacker could actually sniff the inner authentication process offline and derive the password that way. And actually, legacy implementations of EAP were highly susceptible to this. Think like EAP MD5, which is pretty prevalent, like 10 years ago. So when I mentioned that there was actually two parties involved with this transaction, that's a bit of an understatement, and there's actually three. The third being the authenticator. So we talked about the client device. The technical name for that's the supplicant. That's your device that's connected to the network. And you have your authentication server, and this is the radius center that's handling this transaction. But in the middle here, there's something else, and that's your access point. The access point, we refer to it as an authenticator. If you look at the RFCs, that's the name that's used. And the job of the authenticator, the access point, is to kind of act as a mediator between the client device and the authentication server. And the reason why we need this is because the supplicant's speaking over layer 2, and the authentication server only speaks over layer 7 using the radius protocol. So you need this access point in the middle to act as an intermediary. Now remember that this access point, until the process is finished, is acting as an open access point, right? So what this means is that, remember how we talked about how open access points are susceptible to evil twin attacks and other rogue access point attacks. So what that means is that until this process is completed, this access point, the authenticator here, is also susceptible to those very same attacks. So what you can do as an attacker is impersonate a WPA2 EAP network and force clients to attempt to authenticate with you. And if you're using EAP PEEP or EAP of TTLS as your outer authentication mechanisms, then you're going to have a situation where you can force clients to connect to you, force them to authenticate with your own rogue radius server, and hopefully what that will get you is an MS-Chat v2 challenge and response, which you can then use to derive radius passwords or radius NT password hashes, which are password equivalent. So this attack that I'm just describing was first described by Brad Antonowitz in 2008, and to make it even worse, actually, is anyone here familiar with MS-Chat v2? Okay, out of you two who raised your hands, how many people think that MS-Chat v2 is amazing? Yeah, I see some pretty, like no. Okay, so yeah, MS-Chat v2, the problem is that, EAP PEEP, for example, this outer authentication protocol, it's bad enough that you can force stuff to connect to using a rogue AP attack, but the inner authentication mechanism that's used typically is MS-Chat v2. And there are a couple ways of cracking MS-Chat v2. The traditional way is that you take that EAP challenge or response that you've captured, and you just iteratively perform a dictionary attack. You take the password and the challenge, and then try to combine them to create an MS-Chat v2 response, and you try these sequentially over and over again until you find the right password. That's a dictionary attack. Unfortunately, the success rate of this attack is inversely proportional to the strength of the password. So if you have a really complex password, the more complex the password, the more you're going to get diminishing returns. Fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on your perspective, in 2012, a couple of researchers named Moxie Marlinspike and David Holton came up with a divide and conquer attack that can just completely bury MS-Chat v2. It turns out that they discovered that MS-Chat v2 uses it's basically 3DS encryption. So if you're not familiar with what that means, 3DS, you can actually break it down into a single DES of encryption, which is only 56 bits. NTLM v1 actually has the same problem, and because you can reduce it to this very, very small 56 bits of encryption, you can actually recover that password equivalent NT hash that we mentioned earlier, within 24 hours using a proper FPGA-based cracking rig with a 100% success rate. So it's very, very, very crackable. So just a quick demo of how this attack works. Right now, from the attacker's perspective, you'd first create a cert, which is what you're seeing here. And this is just a simple self-signed cert. And once you create that certificate, yeah, you then create the evil twin of the network that you're targeting. I'm going to kind of fast forward through that a little bit. And you're going to get a client associating. So you see like the client associating with your network. And this is what you'd see on the attacker's perspective. You'd see the username, the challenge, response, and that would all be sent to you as the client device attempts to authenticate with you. From there, the dictionary attack, what it would look like using ASLeap would be this. The divide and conquer is a bit complicated, so I'm not really showing it here. But that's pretty much what you'd see. And you see we were able to recover a password that way. So the mitigation for this was introduced about 10 years ago as well. This was in 2008. There was in RFC 5216 a new form of EAP was released called EAP-TLS, and EAP-TLS uses mutual certificate-based authentication, for its outer authentication layer. So because of this use of client-side certificates, it pretty much stops rogue AP attacks dead in their tracks. The problem with EAP-TLS is that it's also like really, really difficult to integrate. Any network administrators out there? No network administrators. Wow. Okay, so well, from the perspective of a network administrator, the difficulty is that EAP-TLS can be really difficult to implement. You have to have an internal CA that you set up. You have to have a certificate placed on every single device that you want to be able to connect to your network. And all of this essentially creates a classic security versus convenience scenario where you're forced to choose between an authentication mechanism that's very, very difficult to implement, or use a very insecure authentication mechanism in the form of EAP-PEEP or EAP-TLS. So, this creates a market gap where products that you have people essentially. This creates a market gap for products that can be used to compensate for the security issues found in EAP-PEEP and EAP-TLS, but are also easy to deploy and easy to use. So the current trend that we see a lot is instead of focusing on breach prevention, which would be preventing attackers from accessing the network in the first place, you instead see a focus on containing breaches that occur once the attacker is on the network. And I guess what we're trying to address here is whether or not this strategy actually works. And before we continue, I have a little cartoon for you. Okay, that should be some foreshadowing of what lies ahead. So the most popular way by far of addressing the problem of breach containment is to use a NAC mechanism to distinguish between authorized and unauthorized endpoints as they're added to the network. So the idea here is a new endpoint is added to the network, aka a new device connects to the wireless network. The NAC identifies whether this new endpoint is authorized to be there or if it's not authorized to be there. If it's not authorized, some kind of restriction is placed on the device, usually placed in a quarantine VLAN where it can't really touch anything. There are two ways, historically we've had two ways of doing this. You have agent-based NACs and you have agentless NACs. So agent-based NACs, the way that it works is that you have a software component called an agent that's installed on every single authorized endpoint on the network. And these agents communicate with the brain of the NAC and report back information about both the internals of the device as well as external information as well. So this is really, really effective. Unfortunately, now you're in another situation where you have to have a piece of software living on every single device on the network, and this makes it pretty much just as impractical as EAP-TLS. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have agentless NACs. Agentless NACs, they use a combination of like passive fingerprinting, active scanning, a traffic analysis, stuff like that. And the idea here is to take a completely external approach to identifying endpoints. However, the problem with this is that you have no way to identify the internals or examine the internals of network components, so you can easily bypass these just by finding an authorized device to masquerade as. So, this kind of leads us back to the same problem we looked at before. You have a recurring dilemma in security versus impracticality. You have on one side of the spectrum, you have these highly effective solutions in the form of agent-based NACs. You also have very easy to deploy, but also less than effective solutions in the form of agentless NACs. So this leads to another market gap, right, where there's a huge demand for a solution that can offer deep interrogation capabilities that you find with an agent-based NAC, but without all that additional overhead. So this has led to the rise of the next generation NAC. These are actually pretty interesting. There are a lot of really interesting solutions to them. There's one in mind that I thought was a really interesting approach, but also just at the same time really just kind of drives the point home as to why this isn't an easy paradox to bridge. Unfortunately, I actually tried to borrow one from work to bring here and do a demo with. So I opened up a ticket. Of course, that didn't really go as, I probably should have expected that. But interestingly enough, also legal kind of reached out to me. It was like, dude, you got to keep this vendor neutral. So I'm like, okay. So in the interest of being vendor neutral, we're going to refer to this hardware vendor as vendor A. And if you're really curious, I'm sure you could find a bunch of products that kind of match the description on Google. But a really good example of this is vendor A. Vendor A uses WMI to interrogate new devices as they're added to the network. And by doing this, it's able to perform those deep internal checks without using an agent. And the way that it does this is it authenticates over SMB using a single administrative service account. So a device gets added, it authenticates with the device using the service account, or attempts to, and then at that point, once it's authenticated with this device, it uses some pretty deep administrative privileges to look at the internals of the device and examine how it works. The problem with this is it creates a single, well, anyone see a problem with this yet? Yeah, responder. So you have a single point of failure. You have a device that's attempting to authenticate with everything that's added to the network using the special service account. And this service account has access to nearly everything on the network. Typically, it has DA privileges, actually, which is really scary. So you have this device that, although it's able to do these deep checks relatively easily, it's also sending God mode hashes to anything that you add to the network. So, of course, the first risk that comes to mind is using, something like Impacket or Responder to perform SMB relay attacks, where you just add something to the network, wait for this thing to authenticate with you, relay the authentication attempt to something else, and pivot into it. And actually, you don't need a man in the middle there because the NAC appliance is trying to authenticate with you. Of course, you can mitigate this fairly easily by enabling SMB signing. Although it's worth mentioning that SMB signing is usually it's disabled by default on everything but the domain controller. But this doesn't really address the issue of hashes being sent directly to untrusted endpoints. So, it's interesting that this vendor actually offers a piece of software that you can install on every single thing on the network to kind of address this issue. This is starting to sound a lot like an agent again. And considering that the chief selling point of this thing is that no agent is required, I feel like we're back to square one again. And once again, I'm not really like, I think most. I don't think that this particular solution is like better or worse than any of the other what's it called, next generation NACs out there. I think it's a really, really good example of how there really is no magic bullet in this situation. You can't really always have security with convenience, and especially when you're talking about access control or authorization or authentication, I think it's actually a total paradox. So, kind of going back to wireless in general, another really interesting wireless security control that you see a lot is client isolation. And the idea behind client isolation is that you prevent wireless devices from communicating with one another. And you usually use this as a security control. Typical use case would be like an open network, like the hotel here, for example. You may notice that you cannot ping other laptops that are associated with the network. And there's a reason for that. The idea is to keep people from attacking each other once they're on the network. So the way that 802.11 is supposed to work is that the AP is supposed to mediate all communication on the network, right? So in theory, if this guy down here, can you guys see my mouse moving around? Cool. In theory, the way this is supposed to work is if this guy here is trying to communicate with this guy, the AP can just intercept the packet and drop and say, no, you can't do that. But the problem with this is that client isolation really is a logical control. It's not a physical control. So back in 2005, the late Cedric Blanchard, awesome researcher, unfortunately no longer with us, he posed the question, how do you prevent radio transceivers from communicating with one another? And the answer was, you can't. So he introduced this tool called Wi-Fi Tap, which was released by Cedric Blanchard in 2005, later revived by Oliver Lavery of Gotham Digital Science. This was actually way before my time. But the idea is that Wi-Fi Tap actually reads packets from the victim to the AP using a Wi-Fi interface in monitor mode. And then it gives you a ton tap device that's bridged to this monitor mode interface and lets you interact with that monitor mode interface. And what this allows you to do, it allows you to inject responses to packets as if they came from the AP. So, this allows you to do two things. One, it actually lets you interact with devices that are associated with a wireless network without actually being associated with that wireless network yourself. And furthermore, it actually lets you bypass client isolation. And I think I covered this stuff. Okay, so there are some later tools that do even more cool stuff. So AirTonNG, you can do the same attack with WEP. TKIP-TonNG, this is also part of the AirCrack suite. You can inject this packet injection stuff, but with WPA1. WPA2, there are some attacks that theoretical attacks anyways that really haven't been implemented that theoretically you're able to do this with WPA2. Hole 196 comes to mind. It's worth mentioning that most of these are purely theoretical and actually have been contested and are really up to considerable debate. But for the sake of being thorough, I just kind of threw them in there. But here's a quick demo of Wi-Fi Tap in general. If you look at the top right, we're actually going to create an access point just using, so we've created here an open access point with the SSID example Wi-Fi. And we're going to connect to it from our host operating system. This is a VM, and this is a second VM, and this is our host right here in the bottom right. So we're going to connect to example Wi-Fi from our host operating system. And then if we go down here, we're just going to send a bunch of ICMP packets. We're going to send 5 ICMP packets to our AP from our host operating system. And you notice that we send 5 ICMP packets, and we receive 5 responses. That's expected. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start up a modified version of Wi-Fi tap called Wi-Fi ping, which is actually a really cool way of demonstrating how this works. And what Wi-Fi ping does is anytime it sees an ICMP request, it injects an ICMP response. So we're going to do that from the attacker's virtual machine over here, which is this terminal you see here. So we're going to start up Wi-Fi ping, and Wi-Fi ping is now running. And we're going to once again send 5 ICMP packets. But notice that instead of receiving 5 ICMP responses, we see 10 ICMP responses. And that's because we're injecting them over from this thing. And that just kind of demonstrates, just a very simple wireless client isolation bypass. So food for thought. We've been, so far, I think a lot of the conversation has really focused around, whether or not a NAC can be used to stop a direct attack from an attacker who's gained access to a wireless network. But what if we're missing the point here? Network access control isn't the only problem when containing wireless breaches. If you think about the role of NAC in a wireless network, it's being used to prevent attackers from accessing sensitive resources after a breach occurs. So when an unauthorized endpoint is detected, you take one of two possible actions. You either place the endpoint in quarantine or you block the port completely. So what this is that when you're violating access control policies, you're causing the NAC to impose some kind of restriction. In a wired network, this is a physical restriction. But in a wireless network, this can only be a logical restriction, as we just saw with Wi-Fi tap. More on that later. So I want you to imagine a pretty typical scenario if you're incorporating a wireless into your red team engagement or your pen test, right? You're attacking the wireless network, and this particular wireless network is used to access sensitive resources. In other words, a legitimate user could get on this wireless network, and from there access stuff like production databases, the domain controller, eventually have that kind of access. It's not just used as a straight pipe out to the internet. So assume you've already breached the perimeter. Unfortunately, you've been placed as the attacker on a quarantine VLAN by this NAC appliance. It's just kind of, here's the NAC, here you are on this quarantine VLAN. Over on the restricted VLAN, there's a bunch of sensitive resources, and that's ultimately what you want to get access to, because if you can't get access to that, you really haven't demonstrated anything in the first place. Fortunately for you, you know that you have at least one victim device on this restricted VLAN, because you would have had to use the rogue AP attack against this victim device in the first place to get radius credentials that would get you onto this network. So the question here is, how do we get out? How do we get from this quarantine VLAN over to this restricted VLAN over here where we can actually get all the goodies like sensitive resources? So, anybody here ever used Responder before? Okay, yeah. I have one. So for those of you who do not know, we have to go over a couple things that we're going to incorporate into this attack that we're going to use to perform this pivot we're talking about. The first is LMNR MBTNS poisoning. So in case you're unaware, the way that NetBIOS name resolution works is that first you're going to check the local when a computer tries to resolve a host name using a NetBIOS name resolution, it first checks its local cache. If that doesn't work, it's going to check its LM host file. If that doesn't work, it's going to attempt to use local DNS. And if that fails, we're going to fall back to two closely related protocols that pretty much behave the same way, LMNR and MBTNS. And the way that works is LMNR and MBTNS is going to send a broadcast request out to the entire subnet. So the way that does this, if you can think of two computers named Alice and Leroy, and Leroy's a file server, and Alice wants to request a file from Leroy, but Alice does not know Leroy's IP. Alice will first attempt to work through those first NetBIOS name resolution steps that we talked about before. But suppose that fails. At this point, Alice is going to make a broadcast request to the entire subnet using LMNR and MBTNS. And every computer on Alice's subnet is going to receive this request. And what happens next really depends on the honor system. The idea is that only Leroy will respond to this broadcast request and provide Alice with an IP. Unfortunately, there's no honor among thieves. If we're an attacker and we're on the subnet, we can simply listen for these broadcast requests and respond to all of them. And if Alice receives two responses, it's only the first one that's going to be considered valid. So this creates a race condition that can be exploited to trick Alice, the victim, into sending traffic to the attacker. So a quick demo of how this works, just using pretty widely available tool called Responder by Lawrence Joffe. And you see here we have a bunch of rogue servers here. We have an HTTP server, HTTPS server, SMB server. These are all listening for authentication attempts. And we have here our poisoners. We have our LMNR and MBTNS poisoners up there as well, and they're running. And we have our victim machine over on the right. So the victim machine is going to attempt to map a non-existent share, or an SMB share on a non-existent host, right? And what that's going to do is, because the host doesn't actually exist, it's going to force it to fall back to LMNR and MBTNS, which will allow us to attack it. So we put in this non-existent host name, as well as an SMB share. And there we have hashes on the left, because we were able to poison that request and force it to try to authenticate with us. So we're about 5% through our little escape attempt here, but there's something else we have to cover as well. The other thing we need to cover is redirect to SMB. So anybody familiar with redirect to SMB? Okay. This guy obviously uses all the things. So redirect SMB, essentially the idea is that you force a victim to visit an HTTP endpoint. And this HTTP endpoint corresponds to an HTTP server that you control. And this HTTP server does one thing and one thing only, and that's redirect all HTTP requests to an SMB share, because you can do that. So what will happen is the victim will click this link, their browser will go to your rogue HTTP server, your rogue HTTP server will redirect that browser to an SMB share that on a server that you control. The browser will then be forced to authenticate with your rogue SMB server, and you get hashes that way. So this is pretty cool. It also requires social engineering, because you have to force a user or coerce a user some way to click this link. So this is where we're going to start talking about new stuff. The first new attack that we're going to introduce is the hostile portal attack. And it's essentially a combination of the stuff we just talked about. And it's a means of kind of leveraging this stuff to steal AD creds from a wireless network without network access. So, have you guys seen something like this lately? A captive portal? Yeah, they're pretty cool, right? So a captive portal, it's used to restrict access to an open Wi-Fi network. And the way that they usually work is that you typically have a specially configured DNS server that's running that resolves all DNS queries to the captive portal. And also all DNS traffic will be redirected to the captive portal, so that the user cannot just manually specify their own DNS server. In addition to that, if you really want to be nasty, you can also redirect all HTTP traffic to the server that's hosting this captive portal login page. So the net effect is, no matter where you try to navigate to, you're just redirected to this login page. So a hostile portal attack kind of expands on this, right? It's based on both the redirect to SMB and also like a captive portal technique. And the idea is that you first force a victim to connect to you using a rogue AP attack. But then what you do is you simply redirect all HTTP traffic to an SMB share on your machine, and you run a rogue SMB server in the background. So what happens is that the user is forced to connect to you, but instead of being redirected to a captive portal, they're forced to redirect to your rogue SMB server. And what happens is then they're forced to authenticate with you, and they give you hashes. So it's a really fast way to grab hashes. In addition, in case that they just have to be idle at the time, you can also poison LMNR and MBTNS in the background. So you can also attack them that way as well simultaneously. So a quick demo of how this would work. We have here where this machine here is our legitimate network, and our victim is down in the bottom right and is associated with this legitimate network. This is an open network. We're going to talk about how to do this with EAP PEEP networks in a second, but there's a couple more steps involved with doing so. And over here we have the attacker. The first thing the attacker is going to do is use some deauth package to force this victim to roam over to the attacker's rogue access point. Now the victim in the bottom right is going to open up IE, and the second that it tries to start sending HTTP traffic, you end up with hashes, which is what you see here. Actually, a really interesting thing about IE, right, is that when you type stuff in the address bar, it does an autocomplete thing which sends an HTTP request. So every time we type a new letter in here, we're actually receiving the hashes over and over again. So good job, IE. So yeah, in most cases, we also need to talk about how to do this with a WPA EAP network, because in order to kind of tie this to the scenario we were talking about addressing earlier, we need to be able to use this with networks that use EAP TTLS or EAP PEEP. This actually is significantly harder because both of these use MS-ChaVi2 as an internet authentication mechanism. And what this means is, what I mean by mutual authentication mechanism is that the Radius server must actually prove knowledge of the client device's password for the internet authentication attempt to succeed. So previously, we were able to demonstrate that you can force a victim to associate with you and attempt to authenticate with you, right? And it will go through all the steps of the authentication process to the point where you actually have an MS-ChaVi2 challenge or response, which you can crack offline to derive Radius credentials. Unfortunately, what's going to happen at the very end of that process is that you as the attacker, or you as the authentication server, need to then authenticate back with the client and demonstrate to the client that you also know the client's Radius password. And if you can't do that, the authentication attempt is going to fail. So, this is something that we really need to overcome because pretty much any interesting rogue AP attack that you want to do, aside from simply stealing Radius credentials, you're going to need a full association from those clients that are connecting to you. Now, there are a couple ways of doing this that already exist. For weak Radius credentials, you can use something called auto crack and add. This is a technique that was developed by Dominic White and Ian de Villers in the same talk where they improved karma attacks in 2014. And that'll work for weak Radius creds. For stronger Radius creds, remember that we can crack MS-ChaVi2 challenge and responses relatively quickly. So of course you could just crack them offline, come back, and finish the attack once you have valid Radius credentials. Let's talk about both of these. So, at the very end of the MS-ChaVi2 challenge, MS-ChaVi2 authentication process, the victim is going to send a challenge response. By the way, this over here is the victim. This over here is host APD. Host APD is essentially what you use as a Radius server whenever you're performing this kind of attack. So the first thing that's going to happen at the very end of the MS-ChaVi2 authentication process is that the victim is going to send a challenge response, and that's the thing that you use to crack the Radius creds, to your Radius server, which is host APD. Host APD at that point is going to attempt to load the victim's password from this thing called the EAP user file. The EAP user file is essentially a primitive database that's implemented using a text file that has information about different users and how they can authenticate and what their passwords are, etc. So it's going to attempt to load that password. And then from there, it's going to use that password to construct an authentication response that is sent along with the authentication success message to the victim. Of course, if you don't already have the user's password or password hash, or NT password hash, should I say, you're not going to be able to accurately construct this authentication response. So this part of the process here is going to fail, and and the authentication attempt is going to fail. So the way that you get around this using auto crack and add is the way that it works is that the second you receive the challenge response, you actually modify host APD so that instead of immediately loading the password from the EAP user file, you instead shoot off the challenge and response off to a remote cracking rig somewhere, which presumably is equipped to crack these passwords relatively quickly. So you essentially make an API call to your cracking rig. The cracking rig at this point cracks these Radius, the MS-ChaVi2 challenge and response to get an NT password hash, and then you just append that NT password hash or password to the end of the EAP user file. At that point, you continue with the MS-ChaVi2 authentication process by loading the newly appended password from the EAP user file, use that to construct the authentication response, and send that with the authentication success message off to the victim. So that can work with weak passwords, and it could take anywhere between a few seconds, or it could take a couple tries, because really it boils down to can you crack it in time before this authentication attempt times out. But for relatively weak passwords, this should work between like 4 or 5 tries. For stronger passwords, for stronger Radius passwords, you aren't going to be able to do this because you're not going to be able to crack it in time. But remember that with the divide and conquer technique, you have a 24-hour maximum the amount of time if you're using FPGA-based hardware to crack these credentials. So here's a demonstration of how you just incorporate the auto crack and add technique. It looks a lot like what we did before. We first force the it's going to take a couple tries to force the victim over here to associate with the attacker, to authenticate with the attacker. And you see here this time the victim's being prompted with this certificate warning because we've given them an invalid certificate. But we've gotten them to associate with us. And as before, the second they open up IE, HTTP traffic is sent. We're able to redirect that to our SMB server, and we get their password hashes that way. So what this gets you is lots and lots of NTLM hashes. You actually get really similar results to what you'd get with LMNR and MBTNS poisoning. There are a few key advantages here. For one thing, you don't need direct network access. You don't actually have to be like on the network in order to do this. The other thing is that you're not limited to just attacking a local subnet. You get everything that's connected to wireless. So that's pretty important. And most importantly, it's not a passive attack. You're not waiting for broadcast requests to appear on a local subnet. You're actually making this happen. So back to our scenario. We can use this technique that we just talked about, the hostile portal. We can build off of that to do something called an indirect wireless pivot. And that's a way of using rogue AP attacks to bypass port-based access control mechanisms. So we mentioned here that we're stuck on our quarantine VLAN, and we want to get over to this restricted VLAN and be able to access these sensitive resources here. And we have a victim device that is on the restricted VLAN as well. And we have this NAC that is kind of preventing us from doing that. So the first step that we can do, we can first use a rogue AP attack. Well, actually, assume that we have two network interfaces, first of all. Our first interface has an IP address on this quarantine VLAN. The second interface is free to perform more attacks. So we're going to use the second wireless interface to force this victim device over to our own network that we control using a rogue AP attack. At this point, the particular rogue AP attack we'd use a hostile portal attack, and that would allow us to redirect their HTTP traffic to an SMB share that we control. And that, as before we were able to demonstrate, this will allow us to obtain their NTLM hashes, which we can crack offline, right? And at this point, we continue the attack where we left off. We might have to repeat the step where we get them to connect to us once we've cracked their NTLM hashes. And at this point, we're able to use that access to place a timed payload, like a scheduled task or something like that, on the victim. We then kill a rogue AP. This allows the victim to reassociate with the wireless network that they were on previously. Now, this victim, despite the fact that we've exploited it, it is still an authorized device. So the NAC mechanism here moves it to the restricted VLAN. At this point, we wait for that scheduled task to execute. That gives us a reverse shell to our interface that's on the quarantine VLAN and allows us to pivot onto the restricted VLAN through the authorized device. So that's a simple indirect wireless pivot. There's a better approach to doing this if you can pull it off. So suppose you have two victim devices and an account that can be used to access both. You could then force both of these devices to associate with you. And as before, you'd use the hostile portal to get them to send you NTLM hashes. At this point, though, instead of just simply capturing hashes, we're going to relay that authentication attempt using an SMB relay attack from one victim to the other. This will allow you to instantaneously place a timed payload on one of the victims. You let the victims reassociate with the target network as before. They're moved back to the restricted VLAN because they're still authorized devices. And as before, we wait for the reverse shell. So, quick demo of what this would look like. We have Leroy and Jenkins are our victim devices here. Leroy's in the top right. Jenkins is in the top left here. We have our attacker. Anybody here ever use Empire? You again. So we have an Empire instance running here. We're going to be using Empire to manage our payloads. We're going to be using Impacket to do our SMB relay attack, and we're going to be using EPAMR to do our rogue AP attack. And over here we have our legitimate access point that these two victim devices are connected to. And I'm going to kind of fast forward this. So we have two listeners set up, and we also have our SMB relay server running there. So we're going to start our SMB relay server. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pass initial PowerShell payload to our SMB relay server. That's going to execute when we first perform the SMB relay attack when they connect to us. And then we're going to start EPAMR here. And then, as before, we're going to send some deauth packets to these two devices to get them to roam from the legitimate access point over to our rogue access point. So we're going to do that really fast. And it's kind of lagging there, but wait for it. There we go. Okay. So that gets us one device associated with us. All right, step 2, we want to repeat that with the second victim device, Leroy. All right, now we have Leroy associated with us as well. At this point, we need to pull off the SMB relay attack, right? So we're going to first start our SMB relay. Well, we're first going to need to obtain the IP address of one of these devices that's associated with us. So we're just going to pick one from this output that we see here, copy it over to our SMB relay server here, and we're going to just paste it in there, start the SMB relay server. Now, for demonstrative purposes, we're going to start generating some HTTP traffic on one of these target endpoints. So we do that here simply by just typing stuff in the browser like we saw before. And you see some activity there. That's the SMB relay server doing its thing, performing the SMB relay attack. And what you should see in about 40 seconds or so in Empire is an Empire agent connecting back to our Empire instance. And that will get us our initial shell. And there you go, initial agent from 10.0.0.184 now active. We now interact with that agent. And at this point, we have, if you look here, I'm going to actually fast forward a bit. As you can see here, we now have NC authority system privileges on Jenkins, which is this victim right here. So at this point, both of these devices are still associated with a rogue access point attack, but we've used an SMB relay attack to obtain a shell on this guy right here, on Jenkins. So we're going to use that initial shell to place a scheduled task on Jenkins that is going to connect back to our first interface, which is currently associated with a target network. And it's going to do that after like a set period of a few minutes. So we're going to do that really fast. I'm going to kind of speed through that. And at that point, now we just kill our rogue AP. And you'll notice here that in our legitimate AP that the victim devices are reassociating with us. So we've lost our initial shell, and when these devices are no longer directly connected to us, they're back on the target network. And now we just wait for the scheduled task to execute the payload and connect back to us. So something really interesting happened when I was actually recording this demo video. And in that I actually forgot to do the thing in VMware where you connect the virtual network interface to your box, to the attacker machine. So initially what happened is that the time payload or the amount that delay finished, and I was like, okay, so where's the shell? I don't know what's going on here. And then I realized that I'd forgotten to connect a thing. So I was originally going to refilm this and restart the demo from scratch, but something really interesting happened, which is that it turns out I'd actually set 120 retries on this agent to connect back. So this thing would 120 times attempt to keep connecting back to that listener. So what ended up happening was, and if you can kind of see here, I'm going to get to the point where I reconnect it. And you see here I hit the back button. Oh, yeah. As soon as I did that, I just got the connection anyways. So I thought I'd leave that in there because it was kind of cool. And it kind of, at this point we actually have, as soon as I reconnected the USB interface, within seconds I had that reverse connection. I thought I'd leave that in there because it was kind of cool and proves a point about, well-written malware and well-written implants, which is that, even if you are in a situation where you can't get a reverse connection immediately, you can still write something that just keeps attempting to in various ways until it finally connects back to you. So that's an indirect wireless pivot. I mean, the equivalent technique of doing this on a wired network would be simply unplugging an authorized device from a switch or something like that, and then connecting it to a hostile network on which you can attack it. And what this really demonstrates is that port-based access controls, they rely on the assumption that the physical layer can be trusted. In a wireless network, on the other hand, the means through which you can trust the integrity of the physical layer is WPA2 EAP. So if you can't trust your EAP implementation, and an attacker can freely control the physical layer using rogue access point attacks, this kind of makes the point of whether NAC works or not kind of moot. Because if the attacker can control the physical layer, port-based NAC mechanisms are actually rendered useless. So what this demonstrates is that port-based NAC mechanisms, they don't effectively mitigate the risk presented by weak WPA2 EAP implementations. And also they demonstrate that adding port-based NAC mechanisms to a wireless network, it does not make the use of EAP TTLS or EAPP any less inappropriate if the network in question is used to grant access to sensitive information. I'm going to, before we kind of wrap this up, I'm going to make like one last ditch plug for EAP TLS, which is that it's actually not as bad as it used to be. I mean, you can use group policy to configure 802.1x on clients. That makes this a lot easier than it used to be. And your best option for rolling out EAP TLS is just to use a private CA and to leverage Active Directory as much as possible to deploy EAP TLS. If you're dealing with an MDM, or I'm sorry, if you're dealing with a bring your own device situation, I mean, you can distribute that server cert to clients using either an MDM solution or a really streamlined BYOD onboarding solution. And you can actually use Let's Encrypt for that as well, although it's worth mentioning that even the folks at Let's Encrypt have stated this is far from the best option out there. So just to close this up, just because wireless and wired networks do not operate, just because they operate similarly at the logical level, and that's on purpose, right? You don't want to have to be able to observe the differences between using Ethernet or a wireless network when you're using the network, because that's kind of why we have that layered of abstraction. But just because these things work similarly at the logical level does not mean they work the same way at the physical level. So as a community, we should really question whether it's truly a sound business decision to neglect EAP-TLS in favor of a more reactive approach that focuses on access control and threat containment. And finally, last but not least, most importantly actually, the needs for convenience and security are often at odds with one another. So maintain a healthy skepticism towards solutions that promise both. And that's it. Thanks. Any questions? Sure.
So something I learned is that radius servers have to store the password in plain text?
Yeah.
That's concerning for a couple of networks that I know. Okay.
Yeah. Well, HostAPD does, actually, which is the radius server that you'd use to perform the attack. As for individual radius implementations, they may not work that way, but I know HostAPD uses the EAP user file.
Oh, okay, so they don't all work.
Yeah.
And then early on you demonstrated, you talked about using Evil Twin on a WK2 EAP network.
Yes.
Very early on in the presentation. Wouldn't that trigger certificate errors?
So yeah, you'd get a prompt. The user would get a prompt. So yeah. Well, that's what you're banking on. The problem is that you're placing you're placing the burden onto the user to reject that prompt. And with an organization of like 200 to 300 people, I mean, I don't know, man. Think about your workplace. Do you trust everyone not to click that prompt? What's up?
So to your point about GPO, if the GPO is configured right, they won't get that problem.
True. But that rules out BYOD as well. What's up?
So during the attack that you demonstrated last, you had a PowerShell reverse connection back to the attacker machine, correct?
Yes.
And you had said that you were entering for a system, but that wasn't strictly necessary, right? You could have just been a standard user that executed, some PowerShell payload later on. It didn't have to be the system.
You would need. That's a good question. So for that particular attack, you would need the necessary privileges to, one, be able to access the device in the first place. You'd also have to have at least like local admin on that device because you'd need to be able to do something like create a scheduled task to make that thing connect back to you in the first place. So you would need some level of administrative access in order to make that work. If you're
So realistically, then, do you have how quickly do you need to progress? Is that like a automated thing that can be done, or realistically, how do you see that happening?
You could probably automate that using the Empire API. I have not done that, but it can be done. Realistically, though, I mean, you'd want to automate it as fast as possible. So I mean, that's doing it over a few minutes, which is decent. But of course, there's room for taking it beyond a proof of concept stage and actually making it happen lightning fast, which is ideally what you'd want. Something else that's worth mentioning, though. You know how we use to schedule a task in order to get the reverse shell to execute? Well, that might not always be the best way to do it, because if you're talking about a realistic scenario, you'd want something that doesn't necessarily touch disk. So a better way to do this would actually be to have something that lives completely in memory and is more event-driven. So it listens for a network change. So it just, is someone logging, or am I back on the network? And then it would shoot you the reverse shell. Which doesn't have to be a reverse shell back to the first interface. I mean, you could actually just do an outbound connection to something else. You could just have it autonomously start doing situational awareness moves, trying to figure out. There are a lot of different ways of doing it, but that's just an easy, straightforward way to just kind of explain it. So that's kind of why I did it that way. Anything else? Sure.
So you were saying even when you have certificates on both ends, you can still see users being able to easily just click through and negate a lot of that security.
If you have certificates on both ends, that mitigates this issue. That's EAP-TLS.
Okay.
So that's how you. The problem is that people, organizations, they often tend to balk at the idea of rolling out something like that. Unfortunately, but yeah, that's I think what I'm trying to push for is using that more because. I've seen it twice this past year, which is not great. But actually, the first time I saw it, I was thrilled. I actually went up and shook the guy's hand because I was like, someone's actually doing this. Wow. But then again, remember, I work primarily with clients like in the finance sector, like in the Northeast corridor area. So this may be different for like, if you're working like in medical or DoD, you might see different statistics. So yeah, that's just my own personal experiences with that. Anyone else? No? All right. Well, thank you.